Welcome back to Think Inclusion Podcast. This week we meet Danielle and Sophie Wood, a couple who met over 30 years ago, and today we'll tell you their story about their experiences of Sophie coming out as transgender 19 years into their relationship. After initially marrying as husband and wife, they now live happily as wife and wife, but the journey to today hasn't been a smooth one, and we're fortunate enough that they're willing to tell us their story to help us as listeners understand more about some of the realities of being transgender, and also for both of them the major life changes that came with that transition for Sophie. They're both nothing but honest throughout today's episode, and this episode does include references to suicide. It was my pleasure to meet Danielle and Sophie, and I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I did talking to them both. Enjoy. Hello everyone, and welcome to Think Inclusion Podcast, the podcast with me, Garry Clarke-Strange, your host, who meets a whole range of people and talks to them about their story of real life in order to help us all think differently about the area of inclusion and learn more. I am delighted today to be joined by two fantastic people who will introduce themselves and tell you a bit about their story and what makes them unique, and also their message that they want to spread around the world to anybody who's listening to this podcast. So to get started then, let's move over to you both. We have Sophie and we have Danielle. Hello, welcome.
My name is Danielle Wood, and my pronouns are she and her, and I am cisgender.
And I'm Sophie Wood. My pronouns are also she, her, and I'm binary transgender. So just a quick explanation of that. Quite simply, trans and cis are just Latin stem words. So trans is Latin for on a journey. So you go from point A to point B. Cis is congruent, no journey is necessary. So you start at point A and end at point A. That's it.
And I work in this space. That's a new definition for me, which I'm definitely going to steal. Now that we know you both by your names, your pronouns, and how you identify, can you tell us a bit about your background, your personal life, and you know how we've got to today?
Yeah, sure. So we both grew up in the UK, in different parts of the UK during the 1970s and the 1980s. I was in Surrey and Sophie was up in the West Midlands. We met 32 years ago at university in Southampton. And at that point, we fell in love. And then we left university, and then we set up home together. And if you fast forward 10 years from there, we then got married as husband and wife. And it wasn't until 2011, after 19 years together, that Sophie turned up in our lives. And then we became wife and wife. So after a really, and I do mean really bumpy start to that new phase of our lives, and a little bit of time living apart to work out what we wanted to do, we both ended up living in Spain on the sunny Costa del Sol. After all the drama subsided, we followed that dream, and we built a little family here by welcoming 3 rescue dogs called Woody, Munchkin and Frodo into our home. And so that is a very brief snapshot of here we are on our journey.
So that's kind of a brief overview of home life. I think professionally, we followed different career paths, but we've ended up working in the same place, the same department, for the same organisation. So that once that happened, it was in the UK. So we both worked for the UK Police Service. And then again, it happened in Gibraltar, working for one of the online gaming giants. We've both headed up separately diversity and inclusion functions within these different organisations we've worked in. My personal career path started in working in the care field. So I started off as a teenager working with elderly people, and then my first proper job was working at the Royal School for the Blind in Surrey. So I specialised with supporting people who had got acquired head injuries, brain injuries, so supporting them in kind of retraining in life skills. And then I decided to focus in the field of learning development. So I was originally trained to be a teacher. I ended up actually leading the diversity inclusion function of 2 online gaming companies. And more recently, I've got into the field of mental health first aid training. Danielle's path was different. She started in sales and marketing before she moved into recruitment. And from there, she specialised in, talent development, and ended up the diversity inclusion function before becoming a human resource business partner. And more recently, she's actually upskilled and has become an excellent accredited coach and accredited with the ICF.
Wow. What a what a journey for both of you in both personal and work life. Different scenarios, working together on occasions. Wonderful to see a story where, despite the challenges and the bumps in the road that you faced over time, that you're still together 30 years later, which is just so lovely to hear. One thing you talked about there was some of the struggles that you went through as part of your, for want of a better term, coming out journey with Sophie. Can you talk to me a bit more about that, and how was that the reality of that scenario?
To cut long story short, I'm in my mid-30s. Anybody outside looking in would have thought I had a perfect life. So wonderful relationship with my wife, great relationship with friends, family, great work in life, great friends, networks, nice house, couple of cars, everything was working absolutely well. But at that time, I was actually suffering from mental ill health. So I was kind of engaging in self-harming behaviours, long periods of depression. And so I kind of engaged in talking therapies with a psychologist to try and work out why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Now, it was a really good psychologist. I worked with her for 2 years. As part of that process, this one session in particular, I actually had what I can only describe as an epiphany moment, where I actually kind of remember looking back in my chair in the room and thinking, oh my God, I'm transgender. And at that moment, everything just kind of fell into place in my head. It was a kind of quite unusual experience, which was joyful, but at the same time, it induced great feelings of fear and dread, because I thought, if I'm going to act on this, what's this going to mean to my life? So I was really kind of scared about losing everything. And that happened to a larger extent. So when I came out to my family, my mother, father and brother, who I'd had really close relationships with, they decided that they couldn't live with me or kind of continue in our relationship. So they wrote me a letter. My mum, I think the word she used was, I'll never be able to accept anything other than the beautiful boy that I gave birth to. And that's like 13 years ago. And that's the last time we spoke. That's quite distressing, losing your kind of immediate family in those circumstances. All of our friends that were growing up reacted very badly. So we lost a lot of friends. And it had other kind of financial implications as well. Lost Danielle in the short term, because obviously she didn't sign up for that when we walked down the aisle. Yeah, so everything did kind of fall apart. Now, bear in mind, this is kind of quite a big life-changing movement. It took a great deal of actually courage to actually kind of break the news to everybody. And I was in the medical process, and I'd got a referral to Charing Cross, which is one of the main gender identity clinics in the UK. But shortly after being accepted onto that care pathway, they wrote me a letter saying that they were refusing my treatment because my local health authority wouldn't fund it. So this is what we term a bump in the road. So I reacted really badly to that. So I started kind of self-harming again, abusing alcohol, and tried to end my life, which very nearly happened. We both worked for the police at the same time. I tried to do myself an injury with lots of sharp implements. Danielle arrived shortly after the emergency first responder arrived. The sad news was, obviously, I was in a kind of very destructive cycle, because I, talk about putting all your eggs into one basket. That's what I'd done, and it was all being taken away. So Danielle, God bless her, she actually went down to our local GP surgery, and very uncharacteristic for her, kind of spoke very loudly and shouted at people to try and make things happen. The result of that was I got persuaded to go into a mental health institution, then spent a week in a mental health unit, which was absolutely petrifying. But that was the intervention that was necessary to actually kind of break that destructive circle. And we started to build and move forward from there. How was it for you, Danielle?
The whole experience was hard. As Sophie's described, life as we knew it no longer existed. She was struggling to come to terms with who she really was, and she raced away. It was like she was on this fast train to her destination where she wanted to be right now. And I felt like I was playing catch up, and as she raced off, I kind of felt like I was being left on the platform as the train went away. I spent quite a lot of time just reeling from the news, because of course Sophie had come to a realization several months before she actually got up the courage to share that with me. When she broke the news to me, I think her expectation was that I'd just suddenly go, Yeah, okay, right, what next? And I was sat there thinking, God, what now? Who's Sophie? Did Sophie want out of our relationship? Was she doing this because she wanted to be with a man? Did she even love me? Had she ever loved me? Had our whole relationship been a lie? And then I started going into the more social related things, like worrying what other people would say or think. Then I went into a kind of depressive state of why me? Then I started to regroup and think about, what do I do now? Is this divorce? Should I sell the house? There's all of these things going on. And I have to be honest, it was really quite overwhelming. As Sophie said, she got this bad news and she heard that they weren't going to progress her gender affirming treatment. That night, when she was so low, that in her drunken state, she was just beyond caring. And she did almost die that night. They told us that if the first responder hadn't arrived, she would have bled out on the kitchen floor. Once we'd got Sophie the stability and the care and support she needed, I started to do the same. I went through counselling and I came to terms with what was happening. And I had my own epiphany moment. The counsellor asked me what I was most afraid of. I spent a lot of time being really anxious. But when she asked me that question, without hesitation, I said, losing my best friend.
Wow.
Yeah. And so she just looked at me quizzically and she kind of responded saying, why the devil would you need to do that? And I think it just really stopped me in my tracks because I thought everything was falling apart. Yeah. But it kind of almost flipped a switch in my head. So I think I'd been looking at everything through that kind of traditional societal family lens. And now I needed to focus more on what a new life, a new happy would look like. And specifically a happy that had my best friend at the heart of it. She was still the same person that I'd met and fell in love with. But I describe it as she just comes in different packaging now.
That's a really nice way to look at it. It is moving away from our heteronormative reality of what is expected. But your openness to tell this story shows, I guess, potentially the time to have some growth and space to grow this willingness to share it. But I would imagine that there's a lot of people, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the perception is that the hardest part of somebody beginning their journey is actually that coming out part. But actually, the journey post coming out was equally, if probably not more so, traumatic for you, Sophie, but actually equally for you, Danielle, because you didn't have any understanding that this journey, this part of your life was coming. How do you look back and think, could it have been any different? Because it's hard to look back at it, I guess, but also it's made you who you are today.
We have had lots of conversations around if you were doing it again and if you were giving support or advice to other people, there are loads of bits, aren't there, Sophie, along the way, which could have been different. When I described just now about the fact that when she told me, I was kind of just like running to stand still, and she was off. She was like, I've told you that I'm Sophie and I'm transgender, but now I'm heading to be the Sophie that I want to be. And I hadn't even got my head around what was happening. I think what we've discussed is that actually it would be helpful to prepare that groundwork with somebody and give them time and space to wrap their heads around it. Because of course, Sophie will have been thinking about this for a long time and have thought through all the possibilities and thought of all the questions and the answers. So it's giving the people in your life the time to take it in, absorb it, learn about it, and work out where they are with it, where they're at with it. And Sophie said, not everyone comes on the journey. Sophie's family have not engaged with her for 13 years, but other people have done. For instance, my parents were initially really anti-Sophie, and they just wanted me to break ties and move on. But actually, after that night where she almost lost her life, my mother completely flipped. She kind of picked me up from the hospital and came back to the house because I hadn't slept all night and I hadn't spoken to them for ages, but the police called her, asked her to come. And she did, because she came for me. When she told me to go to bed, it was about 9 a.m. in the morning by the time we got home. And I looked down the stairs over my shoulder and there she was on her hands and knees, cleaning the blood. And from that point forward, sorry.
That's all right. She was thinking, wasn't she? Up until that point, they thought that I just kind of left you in it and was away leading my best life. And it's only when they actually kind of realised the gravity of that situation, it altered that her mindset, didn't it? And thought, oh, this is different to what I thought it was, and that enabled her to change her viewpoints.
And she started to learn then, didn't she? She actually was curious at that point. And there wasn't a lot, to be honest, at that point, there wasn't a lot on, well, there was literally nothing on television and hardly anything on the internet where you could get support. And bless her, I don't know whether you remember this, but there was a television series that summer called My Transsexual Summer on Channel 4.
Yes.
And she actually sat up at night, late night to watch that on Channel 4. And that's where she started to get her first exposure to understanding what the transgender experience was. And as she watched that, she had more questions. And, she talked to me about what she'd watched and what she'd understood from it and what she'd taken away. And that really, really helped build kind of the relationship back up with Sophie, because prior to Sophie's transition, my mum and Sophie were really close. So it was lovely to kind of see that relationship rebuild itself.
But I think we expect in this scenario that, for example, I remember that program being on TV, and although I'm LGBT as a gay male, my exposure in life to that point, I hadn't been exposed to trans people. So I remember learning a lot from watching that program. And I think we expect that it's going to be people, that the reaction is going to be from older generations, but actually it's wide across society. I think it's getting better because we've got your heartbreakers on TV. We've got things now that are bringing this to the foresight more, but that didn't exist 17 years ago.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And I think up to that point as well, because we're talking about kind of 2012, no, 2013, are we, that kind of time? Trans people, in the sense of being community, we're quite alone. So, for example, Stonewall currently get a huge amount of criticism for their support of trans people. But in 2013, Stonewall didn't support trans people at all, quite the opposite. And I was part of one of the original group of trans people that Stonewall consulted with. And I can remember being in meetings and the kind of suspicion and the doubts and the fears of all the trans people in the room, worried that would Stonewall do the right thing by them if they kind of agreed to enter into this kind of relationship of co-support. And that kind of support grew up. Suddenly Stonewall was pro-trans. And that's absolutely brilliant. So brilliant that we've now got this kind of backlash, because it's provoked people.
It does, but when you think about it, if you just take your story alone here, the amount of different, I'm going to use the term area struggles, but, there's so many things that as a trans person and also as a partner of a trans person that you need support with, from everything from finances to medical down to mental health and everything else in between that's come with your journey. We do need support out there for trans people, because I think, again, go back to my point, people think, it's the hard part of just coming out and then you just deal with it. But it's not. It's so much wider than that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And people's perception of trans healthcare is completely kind of off the scale. I mean, you've heard Donald Trump speaking on his election campaign about his kind of notion that children turn up at school, have a sex change operation during the day without the parents' consent. That's the real extreme view, isn't it? But actually getting transgender affirming healthcare is really tough. And it's a really hard slog. Now, you mentioned mental health. We've just given you an insight to the kind of stuff that I was going through. But I was not able to share that with anybody who was providing me care at the gender identity clinic. Because if I'd have shown signs of having mental health struggles, then I had been lifted out of the process and put right back to the start. And they'd say, no, we'll only engage with you once those issues have been sorted. So I was actually in a situation where I couldn't engage with the NHS because of fear that we'd go back to the practitioners at gender identity clinic, that I was actually struggling with my mental health at that time.
And then because masking it is making it worse, right?
Absolutely.
In that period, as you were coming out of this, again, I'm going to use the kind of like the darkness period, maybe. I don't know if there's a better way to describe that. How was work life for you? Because I'm sure at some point that had to keep on going, right? And for both of you.
At that time, as we've already mentioned, we were both working for West Mercia Police. Nobody other than the officers who attended the scene were aware of what had happened with regards to that particular incident that we mentioned. It was necessary for me to actually come out and work and engage with West Mercia Police how that was going to be managed. And that actually worked really well for us. I think on the whole, looking back, we had quite a good experience. So the head of HR did something really good right at the start of the process. And he invited both of us, along with our line managers, to an off-site meeting that he facilitated. He accepted that the policies they had in place weren't fit for purpose. And he did something really powerful. He just kind of, symbolically tore it up in front of us. And he suggested the organisation put us at the centre of how we needed to be supported and what came next. And he invited us to share what we needed. And he gave us both a single point of contact to lean on within the HR people team, in addition to the guaranteed support of our respective managers and the occupational health department. And it's on the basis of that positive experience that I helped write the transition at work policy for that police service. So that was a really kind of useful, positive experience for us.
And it's so good to hear you class that as positive, right? It shows your strength, Sophie, because in some scenarios, you can imagine that being put in that scenario based on it being so real to you, and you're still living it. It's not like it's the past. And having to do that on top, I can imagine it being quite triggering, no?
I mean, I do remember working there at the police with absolute fondness, but it wasn't all roses by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. So you can imagine, characterise the police service as being quite an, alpha male, kind of most militaristic type environment. And there's plenty of those people around at police headquarters. So, for example, people from the firearms department, firearms officers, they would be abusive verbally to me. They would be kind of, poking fun, humiliating me in public. So that was difficult to cope with. I used to train detectives. That was an introductory course, was 1 week long. And so we would get a new set of 10 detectives coming on a Monday morning. And they would sit there, and I'd be at the front of the classroom, and they would be saying things like, pardon my language, but what the fuck is that? And we're going to have to look at this all week. And they'd just be making all of these kind of really nasty comments. And I just had to kind of style that out, really.
How do you do that?
I don't know what specifically I did, but one thing I can say is that by lunchtime on that first day of training, all of that nonsense completely forgotten. And we just had straight kind of tutor-student relationship. And when they walked out of the classroom on a Friday afternoon, they were like saying, "Oh, can I take your contact details, Sophie? Because, we may need your support. We actually have to apply this to investigations and stuff like that." So that was actually quite affirming, because I actually had the opportunity there to actually change hearts and minds of people who weren't very pro LGBTQ, never mind trans.
Again, your strength there is incredible to see how you can take the positive out of that. I'm sure there's so many people who will listen to this who will be appalled to hear the start of how they approach that on day one. And the only thing we can ever do is apologise that you were ever made to feel like that or that happened to you. But then to hear your strength, to then go, the affirmation that you helped turn them around, it gives us all hope. Sometimes people need help to get there, and we're not there to educate, but we are there to help people widen their thinking.
Yeah, no, at the same time, it's really important to mention my actual team and my learning development department were really supportive to me, and they just treated me with dignity and respect from the get-go. And they offered me the opportunity to step out of the classroom and take on, an administration role. But I thought, no, it's really important for me to use my voice. My team just continued with the great relationships we'd actually had before I turned up for work as Sophie. And they were naturally curious about what being trans was and what was happening to me. And they frequently asked me questions, kind of like curiosity, which I was really happy to answer. And they made my workplace feel like a safe haven. Because my home life, the community where I lived, were absolutely hostile to me. But I actually loved going into work. And that motivation that it provided me actually made me improve my performance as a trainer. I've had this with every single organisation I work for. And my immediate team, who are in contact with me on a day-to-day basis, I always have great working experiences with the teams I've worked with. And a huge part of that is we're just daily having that human connection between each other. So all of the kind of nonsense or the hatred that's spurred by ignorance of trans people just doesn't exist. because it actually dissipates on contact with, natural human connection. But I always talk about these concentric rings of hate I've experienced in every organisation. As you go outside of the team into the wider department, and then wider still into the wider organisation, I suddenly just become a trans person. And then people's attitudes tend to be informed by what they get from mainstream media, social media. And so they just kind of see me as this other being, kind of less than human in a lot of cases.
That other word is what is real, right? You're not seeing it as human. It's an other form, which then gives them the permission sometimes to feel like that's okay to treat you different.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge that it's not just a case of, say, me turning up into a team and saying, hey, this is me, accept it. I actually put in a lot of work in terms of my communication skills, in terms of checking my own attitude and behaviour, raising my empathy, to actually kind of help people on their learning journeys without getting upset or taking offence at every kind of thing that was said wrong, perhaps, or if somebody misgendered me by accident, because it was in my interest to do that, and it was in everybody's interest.
There's two things you said there. One is about the word you use, what goes curiosity, and then also, misgendering you by accident. That's okay. These things happen, and the best way we can help people to learn more is through enabling their curiosity. Of obviously, it's respectful, but giving information and then allowing people to make mistakes as long as it is an accident, and helping them to learn from that. Right? So,
absolutely.
So while all this is going on, Danielle, you go to Spain.
Yes.
Talk to us.
Yes.
Tell us what happens.
As Sophie said, on the whole, our experience with the police service was quite supportive. But I came to realise quite quickly that it only really takes one bad apple to ruin this. And I had the experience whereby my manager at the time initially did seem supportive, but within a couple of months, the relationship soured quite a bit. And I remember one day when I was feeling particularly wobbly, she said to me, Danielle, you need to stop swimming in the swamp and get on with your life. And I remember thinking, what? And I said, sorry, could you repeat that? What was that? And she said, you just need to get rid and move on. And I didn't. So then she started to gaslight me. And that was before I even knew gaslighting was a thing. So she'd do things like she'd tell me the wrong time for a meeting. And then she'd make me look really disorganised when I turned up late. And she'd assign me a task and then tell me that wasn't what she asked for when I delivered on it. She'd tell other people that I'd said things about them when I hadn't, basically just making life difficult. And to such a point that I became scared of my own shadow. And I started to have to adopt kind of coping mechanisms to limit her ability to trip me up. And I found myself retreating into myself. And it was kind of a little bit like being in survival mode. And throughout that period, I was also experiencing an incredible amount of white noise from everybody around me, because everybody had an opinion on, what was happening and what I should do now. And I got to the point where I felt so overwhelmed by it. And I was, as I said before, seeing a counsellor through the period. And it was one day when I was with my counsellor, they asked me to just stop for a moment and think about what I really needed. Yeah. And I remember saying, I felt like I just needed to press pause and have some time just to breathe and think. We discussed what that could look like. And she invited me to go back to when I was a teenager and what my life aspirations were way back then. I remember telling her that I only wanted 4 things out of life. Number 1, to find love. Number 2, to have a convertible car. Number 3, to live in the sunshine. And number 4, to have a pool in the back garden. So she said, well, you've already ticked off 1 and 2. She said, so how about you explore 3 and 4? And of course, my immediate reaction to that was, that is just too difficult at the moment. I haven't even got the emotional or physical strength at the moment to even think about doing something like that. But over time, I started to see that it could be the perfect solution. In some respects, I kind of ran away for a while. And I packed up as much as I could into my little Fiat 500. It's sky blue and beautiful. And I set off for the south of Spain and got myself a new job in Gibraltar. And that was in 2013. What was meant to be a 6-month break from things so that I could figure out what my life was going to be like now, it's turned into 11 years and counting. And of course, as you can see, Sophie joined me. out here.
And you're now together living in Spain. I guess you've got the living in the sunshine. Hope you got the pool as well. But you've now created your own business working together. Talk to us about what you're doing in that space.
We realised we learned so much through our personal journey and also through our professional journey. As I say, we both worked in like corporate diversity inclusion roles. And one of the things we identified for ourselves was that the pendulum hasn't really swung that much for minoritized groups over the kind of the last 10 years or so. And we really much realised that most of corporate D&I operates in an echo chamber where they're constantly addressing the people who really get diversity inclusion. So kind of celebrate events, throughout the year, which appeal to a certain demographic, which is about usually between 5 and 10% of all the people that work in an organisation. And then you have this paradox where that actually feels quite exclusionary to the majority of the organisation. And so I strongly felt that the pendulum hadn't moved far enough because we're not talking to the people we need to talk to. And we're not taking people on the journey that they need to go on. So we want to change the hearts and minds of the kind of, 85, 90% of people who really don't care about diversity inclusion at all because it doesn't affect their lives. And so we thought, well, how can we do that? And so we realised that what a lot of companies are missing is the actual kind of the hard yards of work that needs to go into making cultures truly inclusive. Yeah. And so that is actually getting stuck into your kind of supervisors, team leaders, intermediate managers. I'm going to hand over to Danielle shortly to talk about a quote that has inspired her, but both of us, in terms of our outlook on moving the dial within organisations. We've just recently been on a podcast with some people who are working in recruitment. So what we're about is helping companies get their house in order before they start inviting people in. Because quite often you get all of this kind of great messaging and kind of signaling saying, oh, we're inclusive, we're this friendly, we're that friendly. And people come to the organisation and they're just expected to fit in. They don't have the experience that was sold to them. And that's just kind of has a really long-term damaging impact, on the relationship between companies and those communities.
You're speaking music to my ears there, so because it's right. You can bring diverse talent into an organization, but if they don't feel like they can belong, I kind of say don't bother. Yeah, get your house in order before you invite people into dance. That's the absolute way to go forward. Yeah. Tell us about the quote then, Danielle. What's been inspiring you?
Yes. Okay. So the quote is by John Amici, and it's culture is defined by the worst behaviour tolerated. Oh. So I'll let that settle for a second because I had to think about this a lot. And, it's absolutely true. When Sophie talks about that kind of, I call it watermelon employer branding. So you're on the outside and the organisation's website is telling you all the right things. And it's all green and shiny and it's saying, go, 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 come on in. And then when you arrive and you start scraping below the surface of the watermelon, you start to see red appearing. And these little red flags are popping up everywhere. And what you're finding is the culture and the behaviours within the culture don't align with the cultural values. And that's where the culture is your worst tolerated behaviour. If you think about it in very, very practical, simple terms, if you're in a team with a manager, and let's say that in a team meeting, somebody ridicules the personal characteristics or the minority status of somebody in that group, and the manager kind of laughs and joins in, it kind of gives the impression that it's okay. It's okay to be inappropriate. And that's where your toxicity starts to grow and seep in the culture. And that's why those middle managers are so important.
Exactly. Well, it's sustaining it, right? You can do the work, but actually it's got to be sustained. And
yes,
part of that as well, and what you're both bringing to it is real life experiences. The whole premise of this podcast is storytelling and enabling other people to open their curiosity, potentially to ask more questions because they've got just a small piece. So I guess as we're coming to a close of the podcast, I'd like to ask up to both of you, what's the one thing you hope from your story or from the experiences you both had that you hope people take away from today and makes them think for future?
From my perspective, diversity inclusion is not a specialist subject. It's not a kind of a side department. So my message is that to actually achieve the outcomes of any kind of diversity inclusion strategy, then what you're accessing are universal skills. They're not specialist D&I skills. They're skills that everybody can access and bring forward. And so if we're going to bring everybody on the journey, then the focus should be on these universal principles. And it's not complicated, because at the end of the day, you're asking people to be better. You're asking people just to show up with dignity and respect and be kind to other people. I used to say this in the police service when I did my diversity inclusion talks, is I'm a human being, and that's all you are too. And when we accept that premise, then there's no barriers to stop us from getting along and making those connections and working happily together.
I'm smiling at everything. We've got completely different backgrounds and different experiences growing up and life, but actually the ultimate aim here is just to be decent human beings and to be kind. Thank you so much for sharing that, Sophie. Danielle, what do you want people to take away from the podcast?
Do you know what? I would just echo what Sophie said. I think she's covered all the bases. It's really difficult to top that. In case it's of use to you, the Memorable Manager group coaching program I am launching in 2025. The Memorable Manager is about giving managers at all levels self-awareness about their personal impact on others, and also giving them the skills and confidence to build inclusive spaces where people feel safe, and also call out when behaviour doesn't align with the cultural values.
Well, I hope as part of that you share your story with them, or just share this podcast back with them, because that will enable them to create those safe spaces, because that's what it's about as well, feeling comfortable with these topics where you can do it. I learned quite a bit right from the get-go, because I announced right at the start that your description of cis and trans was new to me, but I've learned so much from you both from the last 35 minutes or so. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. So from me to you, I'm sure you've inspired a load of people today who will be listening, and we thank you for being part of Think Inclusion.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It's been awesome.
Thank you so much to Sophie and Danielle. I'm sure you will agree their willingness to be so open was powerful, and I hope that today you've understood more about the reality and difficulties that can come with being trans. This podcast is all about giving people a safe space to share their story in order to inspire others and help them understand more of the challenges that some minorities or marginalised people can face. So if you'd like to share your story, then get in touch with me. I'm Garry Clarke-Strange on LinkedIn, or email me at gary@thinkinclusionconsulting.com. And don't forget, if your business is looking for support in making inclusion a reality, then head to my website www.thinkinclusionconsulting.com. Episode 3 is coming soon. We hope to have you back with us soon.